Dr. Patricia Chen noticed the small classified advertisement buried on page 7 of the Washington Post on a gray Tuesday morning in March 1974. The ad was unremarkable in its simplicity, requesting volunteers for a government-sponsored psychological research study at a facility in rural Virginia. What caught her attention wasn't the content, but the timing. She had been investigating unusual patterns in government research funding for months as part of her work with the American Civil Liberties Union. The advertisement promised participants modest compensation for their involvement in what was described as innovative training techniques for stress management and cognitive enhancement. The language was deliberately vague, mentioning only that volunteers would participate in a week-long residential program designed to test new methods for improving mental resilience in high-stress professions. No specific government agency was named, only a post office box for correspondence. Patricia had been tracking similar advertisements across major newspapers in Washington, New York, and Chicago. Each used slightly different wording, but all shared common elements. Requests for healthy adults between 21 and 35, emphasis on confidentiality agreements, and promises of compensation ranging from $200 to $500. Significant money for young people in 1974. The pattern suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Her interest in these advertisements stemmed from reports she had been receiving from concerned family members whose relatives had participated in similar studies and returned home changed. The reports were maddeningly vague. Personality changes, memory gaps, unexplained anxieties, and recurring nightmares. Most participants insisted nothing unusual had occurred, but their families noticed subtle but disturbing differences in behavior and temperament. The facility mentioned in the latest advertisement was identified only as the Riverside Research Institute, with an address in the small town of Culpeper, Virginia. Patricia's preliminary research revealed no academic affiliations, corporate connections, or research publications associated with this name. The address corresponded to a rural property that had recently been purchased by a shell company with apparent ties to government contractors. 3 weeks after the advertisement appeared, Patricia received a phone call that would launch her into one of the most disturbing investigations of her career. The caller was Janet Morrison, a 26-year-old graduate student in psychology at Georgetown University who had participated in the Riverside study 2 months earlier. Janet's voice was shaky and uncertain as she described experiences that she claimed were affecting her ability to function normally. Janet had responded to the advertisement seeking extra money to help pay for her graduate studies. The initial contact had been professional and reassuring. A brief phone interview followed by medical and psychological evaluations at a downtown Washington office. She was told the study would examine new techniques for helping people cope with high-stress situations, particularly relevant for careers in law enforcement, military service, or emergency response. The week at Riverside had begun normally enough. Janet and 11 other volunteers were housed in a comfortable residential facility that resembled a corporate retreat center more than a research laboratory. The staff was friendly and professional, the meals were excellent, and the initial sessions focused on standard psychological assessments and interviews about stress management techniques. However, Janet's memories of the latter part of the week were fragmented and confusing. She recalled being given injections that staff described as vitamin supplements, participating in sessions that involved staring at flashing lights while listening to repeated audio recordings, and spending hours in isolation chambers that were supposedly designed to promote relaxation and meditation. Most disturbing to Janet were the gaps in her memory. She could remember arriving at the facility and the first 2 days clearly, but days 3 through 6 were a blur of disconnected images and sensations. She recalled feeling extremely drowsy during this period, experiencing vivid dreams that seemed more real than reality, and having conversations with staff members that she couldn't quite remember upon waking. When Janet returned home, she noticed changes in herself that deeply concerned her. Her sleep patterns were disrupted by recurring nightmares involving scenarios of violence and control. She found herself unusually susceptible to suggestion and experienced episodes of dissociation, where she felt disconnected from her own thoughts and actions. Patricia Chen's investigation into the Riverside Research Institute began with routine document searches that quickly revealed a complex web of corporate structures designed to obscure the true nature of the operation. The shell company that owned the property was controlled by another company, which was owned by a trust, which ultimately traced back to contractors known to work with various government agencies. Property records showed that the Riverside facility had been purchased 18 months earlier and immediately underwent extensive renovations. Local contractors who worked on the project described unusual specifications: soundproofed rooms, specialized ventilation systems, and security features more appropriate for a high-security government facility than a research center. Most contractors were required to sign confidentiality agreements that prevented them from discussing their work. Patricia's attempts to contact the Riverside Research Institute directly were met with polite but evasive responses. A receptionist confirmed that psychological research was being conducted at the facility, but claimed that all studies were currently closed to new participants. Requests for information about the research protocols, staff credentials, or institutional affiliations were referred to a legal department that never returned phone calls. The breakthrough in Patricia's investigation came when she identified Dr. Marcus Webb, a psychologist who had been recruiting participants for various government studies throughout the early 1970s. Dr. Webb had an office in downtown Washington and a curriculum vitae that included extensive work with military and intelligence contractors. When Patricia approached him posing as a potential volunteer, his responses revealed knowledge of techniques and programs that went far beyond conventional psychological research. Dr. Webb's office was decorated with certificates and awards from organizations that Patricia recognized as fronts for classified government programs. His casual references to advanced conditioning techniques and enhanced interrogation research suggested involvement in activities that violated established ethical standards for human subjects research. Most significantly, Dr. Webb mentioned that the Riverside facility was one of several sites conducting related studies under what he termed the Umbrella Project. Word of Patricia's investigation spread through networks of activists, journalists, and concerned citizens. Over the following months, she was contacted by dozens of individuals who had participated in studies at Riverside and similar facilities. Each account shared disturbing similarities: memory gaps, personality changes, and ongoing psychological effects that participants couldn't explain or resolve. Michael Torres, a 24-year-old Vietnam veteran, had participated in what he was told was a study designed to help combat veterans readjust to civilian life. Like Janet, his memories of the experience were fragmented and troubling. He recalled being given pills that made him feel detached from reality, participating in role-playing exercises that involved scenarios of captivity and interrogation, and undergoing sessions that he described as mental programming. Since returning from Riverside, Michael had experienced episodes of uncontrollable rage, followed by periods of unusual compliance and suggestibility. His wife reported that he sometimes seemed like a different person entirely, responding to certain phrases or triggers with behavior that was completely out of character. Most disturbing were occasions when Michael appeared to have no memory of his actions during these episodes. Sarah Hamilton, a recent college graduate who had participated in a study supposedly focused on creativity enhancement, described similar experiences. Her week at Riverside included sessions where she was asked to perform tasks while in altered states of consciousness, induced by drugs and sensory deprivation. She recalled being taught mental exercises that she later realized were designed to break down her ability to distinguish between reality and suggestion. The pattern emerging from these accounts suggested that the Riverside facility was conducting systematic experiments in mind control and behavioral modification. Participants were being subjected to techniques that combined psychological manipulation, pharmaceutical intervention, and sensory deprivation to alter their consciousness and behavior in ways they couldn't resist or remember clearly. Each survivor's story contained elements that pointed to a coordinated program with specific objectives. The techniques being employed were sophisticated and appeared to be based on extensive research into human psychology and neurobiology. This was not amateur experimentation, but a professional operation with significant resources and expertise behind it. Patricia's investigation took a dramatic turn when she encountered Dr. Lawrence Freeman, a psychiatrist who had worked as a contractor for the Central Intelligence Agency during the late 1960s and early 1970s. Dr. Freeman had left government work due to ethical concerns about the research he was being asked to conduct, and he was willing to discuss his experiences under condition of anonymity. Dr. Freeman revealed that the Riverside facility was part of a larger CIA program known internally as MK Ultra, which had been conducting experiments in mind control and behavioral modification for over 2 decades. The program had its origins in Cold War fears that communist countries were developing techniques to control human behavior, and the CIA was determined to develop similar capabilities for intelligence and military applications. The techniques being employed at Riverside were refinements of methods developed at other MKUltra sites, including the notorious experiments conducted by Dr. Ewan Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal. These experiments had used combinations of LSD, sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy, and psychological conditioning to break down subjects' personalities and rebuild them, according to predetermined patterns. According to Dr. Freeman, the Riverside facility was specifically focused on developing techniques that could be used to create programmed assets, individuals who could be triggered to perform specific actions while maintaining no conscious memory of their conditioning. The ultimate goal was to create sleeper agents who could be activated when needed, and who would have no awareness of their programmed state during normal life. Dr. Freeman described the research as representing a fundamental violation of human rights and medical ethics. Subjects were being used as experimental animals without their informed consent, and many were suffering permanent psychological damage as a result of their participation. The fact that these experiments were being conducted on American citizens made them particularly egregious violations of constitutional rights. The scope of the MKUltra program was vast, involving dozens of facilities, hundreds of researchers, and thousands of unknowing subjects. Riverside was just one node in a network that extended throughout the United States and into allied countries. The program had consumed tens of millions of dollars in funding and had operated with virtually no oversight or accountability. When Patricia began publishing her findings about the Riverside facility and its connection to CIA mind control experiments, the government's response was swift and coordinated. Official spokespersons dismissed her allegations as conspiracy theories unsupported by credible evidence. The CIA issued a statement categorically denying any involvement in unethical human experimentation. The Riverside Research Institute itself disappeared almost overnight. When Patricia attempted to visit the facility, she found it abandoned and stripped of all equipment and documentation. Local residents reported seeing moving trucks and personnel removing materials from the site under cover of darkness. The property was soon sold to a development company that demolished the buildings and converted the land to residential use. Dr. Marcus Webb and other researchers associated with the facility became impossible to contact. Phone numbers were disconnected, office leases were terminated, and professional affiliations were severed. It was as if the entire operation had been carefully planned for rapid dissolution when exposure became inevitable. Government agencies launched a campaign to discredit Patricia's investigation and the testimony of survivors. Official statements characterized the allegations as the delusions of mentally unstable individuals seeking attention or financial compensation. Medical experts with government connections published papers questioning the reliability of recovered memories and suggesting that the reported experiences were the result of mass hysteria or suggestion. The mainstream media, initially interested in the story, gradually withdrew coverage as government pressure mounted and sources became unavailable. Editors expressed concerns about the lack of documentary evidence and the difficulty of verifying claims that involved classified programs and destroyed records. The story began to be characterized as unsubstantiated conspiracy theorizing rather than legitimate investigative journalism. Most disturbingly, some of the survivors who had initially spoken out began recanting their stories. Janet Morrison, who had been Patricia's first contact, suddenly claimed that her experiences at Riverside had been entirely positive and that she had no memory of the disturbing events she had previously described. Other survivors similarly changed their accounts, insisting that they had been confused or mistaken about what had occurred. Despite the official denials and cover-up efforts, Patricia discovered that her investigation had attracted the attention of a network of researchers, activists, and former government employees who were working to expose the truth about MKUltra and related programs. This informal alliance included psychiatrists concerned about unethical research, journalists investigating government secrecy, and former intelligence officers troubled by what they had witnessed. Dr. Helen Sterling, a psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins University, had been treating patients who exhibited symptoms consistent with those reported by Riverside survivors. Dr. Sterling had identified a pattern of psychological trauma that she believed resulted from exposure to sophisticated mind control techniques. Her clinical observations provided scientific credibility to claims that had been dismissed as fantasy or delusion. Investigative journalist Robert Manning had been tracking similar stories across the country, documenting cases of individuals who had participated in government-sponsored psychological studies and subsequently experienced unusual symptoms. Manning's research revealed a network of facilities and programs that extended far beyond Riverside, suggesting a coordinated national effort to develop mind control capabilities. Former CIA officer David Thompson had worked in the agency's Science and Technology Directorate during the height of the MKUltra program. Thompson provided insider knowledge about the program's structure, objectives, and methods. His revelations confirmed many of Patricia's suspicions and provided context for understanding how such a massive operation could have been conducted in secret. This network began sharing information and coordinating their efforts to document and expose the full scope of the government's mind control experiments. They faced significant challenges, including government surveillance, harassment, and active efforts to discredit their work. However, their collaboration allowed them to piece together a more complete picture of programs that individual investigators could not have uncovered alone. The network also provided support and validation for survivors who were struggling with the psychological aftermath of their experiences. Many participants in government mind control experiments had been isolated and gaslighted, led to believe that their memories and perceptions were unreliable. The network offered them community and confirmation that their experiences were real and that they were not alone. The investigation achieved a major breakthrough when Patricia received an anonymous package containing classified documents that appeared to have been stolen from government files. The documents, stamped with various security classifications, provided detailed information about MKUltra operations and specifically mentioned the Riverside facility and its research protocols. The documents revealed that the Riverside program was officially designated as Sub-Project 142 within the larger MKUltra framework. The stated objectives included developing techniques for memory modification, behavioral conditioning, and cognitive restructuring in human subjects. The program had been authorized at the highest levels of the CIA and had received funding of over $2 million between 1972 and 1974. Detailed reports described the specific techniques being employed at Riverside, including the use of LSD and other psychoactive drugs, sensory deprivation chambers, repetitive audio-visual stimulation, and hypnotic conditioning. The documents confirmed that subjects were not provided with informed consent and were deliberately deceived about the true nature of the experiments they were participating in. Progress reports indicated that the Riverside researchers had achieved significant success in their ability to modify subjects' memories and implant false recollections. They had also developed techniques for creating dissociative states that could be triggered by specific cues, allowing handlers to activate programmed behaviors while the subject remained unaware of their actions. The documents also revealed the existence of other facilities conducting similar research, including sites in California, New York, and Canada. The scope of the program was far larger than Patricia had initially suspected, involving hundreds of researchers and thousands of unwitting subjects. The coordination between sites suggested a level of organization and planning that contradicted official claims that any unethical research had been the result of rogue operators. Most significantly, the documents indicated that the program was ongoing, despite official claims that MKUltra had been terminated. References to Phase 2 implementation and expanded operational deployment suggested that the research had moved beyond experimental stages and was being applied in real-world intelligence operations. Armed with documentary evidence and growing public awareness, Patricia helped establish a formal network for survivors of government mind control experiments. The organization, called Survivors of Mind Control Abuse, SMCA, provided support services, legal assistance, and advocacy for individuals who had been subjected to unethical government research. The formation of SMCA was met with fierce resistance from government agencies and their supporters. Efforts were made to infiltrate the organization, discredit its leadership, and harass its members. Several survivors reported receiving threatening phone calls and experiencing surveillance of their homes and workplaces. The government's aggressive response only served to confirm the importance of the work the organization was doing. SMCA's membership grew rapidly as word spread through various communities. Veterans who had participated in military experiments, college students who had been recruited for psychological studies, and patients who had received treatment at certain psychiatric facilities all came forward with similar stories. The common thread was participation in research that had been misrepresented and that had resulted in lasting psychological damage. The organization documented over 300 cases of alleged mind control experimentation, spanning from the early 1950s through the mid-1970s. The cases involved dozens of facilities across the United States and Canada, suggesting a massive program that had operated for decades with minimal oversight or accountability. The scale of the operation was far beyond what anyone had initially suspected. SMCA also worked to provide therapeutic support for survivors who were struggling with the long-term effects of their experiences. Many participants had developed complex trauma disorders, memory problems, and personality changes that interfered with their ability to function normally. The organization connected survivors with sympathetic mental health professionals who understood the unique nature of their experiences. Legal action became a major focus of SMCA's work. The organization filed lawsuits against the government seeking compensation for survivors and disclosure of information about the full scope of the mind control programs. These legal efforts faced significant obstacles, including government claims of national security privilege and the destruction of relevant documents. As SMCA's work gained momentum, mainstream media outlets began taking notice of the mind control allegations. The combination of documentary evidence, survivor testimony, and expert analysis created a compelling story that captured public attention and raised serious questions about government accountability and the protection of human rights. Television news programs featured interviews with survivors and researchers, bringing the story to a national audience. The visual medium was particularly effective in conveying the human impact of the experiments, as viewers could see the ongoing trauma experienced by individuals who had been subjected to mind control techniques. The credibility of the witnesses and the consistency of their accounts made it difficult to dismiss the allegations as fantasy. Newspaper investigations expanded on the television coverage, providing detailed analysis of the documents and exploring the broader implications of the mind control programs. Reporters tracked down former researchers, government officials, and facility staff members, gradually building a comprehensive picture of how the experiments had been conducted and authorized. The public response was one of shock and outrage. Americans were horrified to learn that their own government had been conducting Nazi-style experiments on unsuspecting citizens. The revelation that thousands of people had been used as human guinea pigs for illegal research violated fundamental assumptions about democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Religious leaders, civil rights organizations, and professional associations issued statements condemning the mind control experiments and calling for accountability. Medical and psychological professional organizations launched investigations into the involvement of their members in unethical research and established new guidelines to prevent future abuses. The international community also took notice of the revelations. Foreign governments expressed concern about American human rights practices, and international human rights organizations called for investigations and accountability. The United States found itself in the uncomfortable position of defending practices that it had condemned when conducted by other countries. Block 11. Congressional investigations begin. The mounting public pressure and media attention eventually forced Congress to launch formal investigations into the government's mind control programs. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, chaired by Senator Frank Church, announced hearings on illegal intelligence activities, including the MK-Ultra program and related research. The Church Committee hearings provided the first official forum for survivors to tell their stories, and for evidence of government wrongdoing to be presented in a formal setting. Patricia Chen and other investigators were called to testify about their findings, and survivors were given the opportunity to describe their experiences to a national audience. The hearings revealed the extensive scope of the mind control programs and the high-level approval they had received. CIA Director William Colby was forced to acknowledge that the agency had conducted unethical experiments on unwitting subjects, though he continued to minimize the scope and impact of the research. Documents presented during the hearings showed that the programs had been known and approved by senior agency officials and had operated for over 2 decades. Testimony from survivors was particularly compelling, as committee members heard first-hand accounts of the psychological damage inflicted by the experiments. Janet Morrison, who had initially recanted her story, found the courage to testify about her experiences at Riverside and the efforts that had been made to silence her. Her testimony was corroborated by other survivors and by the documentary evidence that Patricia had uncovered. The hearings also revealed the systematic destruction of evidence that had occurred when the MK-Ultra program came under scrutiny. CIA officials admitted that thousands of documents had been destroyed in 1973. making it impossible to fully investigate the scope of the program, or to identify all of the victims. This destruction of evidence was itself a violation of federal law and suggested consciousness of guilt on the part of agency officials. Despite the dramatic revelations, the congressional investigations faced significant limitations. Much of the most damaging evidence had been destroyed. Key witnesses refused to testify or claimed they couldn't remember critical events, and the government continued to assert national security privileges to withhold information. Block 12. Legal Battles and Settlements. Following the congressional hearings, SMCA and individual survivors launched a series of lawsuits against the government seeking compensation for the damages they had suffered. These legal battles would continue for years, facing numerous obstacles and setbacks as the government employed every available legal strategy to avoid accountability. The primary lawsuit, filed in federal district court, sought class action status for all individuals who had been subjected to MK-Ultra experiments. The government's response was to deny liability, claim sovereign immunity, and argue that the statute of limitations had expired. Government lawyers also argued that the plaintiffs could not prove they had been harmed by the experiments, despite extensive medical and psychological evidence to the contrary. One of the major challenges in the litigation was the government's destruction of documents related to the MK-Ultra program. Without complete records, it was difficult to identify all victims or to prove the specific details of individual cases. The government argued that this lack of documentation meant that the plaintiffs could not meet their burden of proof, essentially benefiting from their own destruction of evidence. The case proceeded slowly through the federal court system, with years of discovery disputes and preliminary motions. The government's strategy appeared to be delay, hoping that survivors would become discouraged, or that public attention would fade. Many survivors found the legal process re-traumatizing, as they were forced to relive their experiences repeatedly and to defend the credibility of their memories and perceptions. However, the persistence of the survivors and their legal team eventually began to pay off. Internal government documents that had escaped destruction provided crucial evidence of the program's scope and the agency's knowledge of its illegal nature. Depositions of former CIA officials revealed admissions that contradicted the agency's public denials. In 1988, the government agreed to a settlement that provided compensation to verified MK-Ultra survivors. While the settlement amounts were modest compared to the lifetime of suffering many victims had endured, the agreement represented official acknowledgement that the government had violated the rights of American citizens through illegal experimentation. Block 13. The Riverside Revelations. Specific focus on the Riverside facility emerged when former staff members began coming forward with detailed accounts of what had occurred at the site. Dr. James Crawford, who had worked as a research psychologist at Riverside for 6 months in 1973, provided insider testimony that confirmed and expanded on the survivors' accounts. Dr. Crawford described a highly organized operation that employed sophisticated techniques to manipulate subjects' consciousness and behavior. The staff included CIA psychologists, military researchers, and contract employees with expertise in pharmacology, hypnosis, and behavioral conditioning. The facility operated under tight security, with staff members required to sign extensive confidentiality agreements and submit to regular security clearances. The research protocols at Riverside were designed to test the limits of human psychological conditioning and to develop techniques for creating what researchers termed controlled assets. Subjects were systematically broken down through combinations of drugs, isolation, and psychological manipulation, then rebuilt according to predetermined behavioral patterns. Dr. Crawford revealed that many of the subjects at Riverside were not volunteers who had responded to advertisements, but were individuals who had been covertly dosed with LSD or other substances in other settings, and then brought to the facility while in altered states of consciousness. This included patients from psychiatric hospitals, prisoners from federal facilities, and even some individuals who had been drugged without their knowledge in bars or restaurants. The most disturbing aspect of Dr. Crawford's testimony was his description of the programming sessions that took place during subjects' final days at Riverside. These sessions involved implanting specific triggers and commands that could later be used to activate program behaviors. Subjects were conditioned to respond to certain words, phrases, or visual cues with predetermined actions while having no conscious memory of their conditioning. According to Dr. Crawford, the Riverside program had achieved remarkable success in creating individuals who could be activated to perform specific tasks while maintaining normal lives. Some program subjects had been deployed as intelligence assets, unknowingly carrying out assignments for the CIA while believing they were acting of their own free will. Block 14. The International Dimensions investigation into the Riverside facility and MK-Ultra revealed that the program had significant international dimensions, with research being conducted in multiple countries and involving cooperation with foreign intelligence services. Canada had been a major partner in the program, with the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal serving as a primary research site under the direction of Dr. Ewan Cameron. The international scope of the program raised additional legal and ethical questions. American citizens had been taken to foreign facilities for experimentation that would have been illegal in the United States, while foreign nationals had been brought to American sites for similar purposes. This cross-border activity appeared designed to circumvent legal protections and oversight mechanisms in both countries. British intelligence services had also participated in mind control research, sharing techniques and subjects with their American counterparts. Documents revealed that the CIA had funded research at British universities and psychiatric facilities, often without the knowledge of the institution's administrators or the subjects being experimented upon. The international network of mind control research sites had allowed for the sharing of techniques and the development of increasingly sophisticated methods of psychological manipulation. What had begun as relatively crude experiments with drugs and sensory deprivation had evolved into precise behavioral conditioning programs that could alter personality and memory with frightening effectiveness. Survivors from international sites began coming forward with accounts that paralleled those of American victims. Canadian survivors described brutal experiments at the Allen Memorial Institute that had left them with permanent psychological damage. British survivors reported participation in studies at government facilities that had employed techniques later used in American programs. The international dimensions of the program also complicated efforts to achieve accountability and compensation for survivors. Victims who had been experimented upon in foreign countries faced additional legal hurdles in seeking redress, while the involvement of multiple governments created jurisdictional complexities that benefited those responsible for the experiments. Block 15. Scientific and ethical analysis. As more information about the Riverside facility and related programs became available, scientists and ethicists began analyzing the research methods and their implications for human rights and scientific integrity. The consensus among legitimate researchers was that the mind control experiments represented a profound violation of basic ethical principles that govern human subjects' research. Dr. Robert J. Lifton, a psychiatrist who had studied thought reform and psychological manipulation, characterized the MK-Ultra program as psychic decimation that deliberately destroyed subjects' psychological integrity. The techniques employed at Riverside and similar facilities were designed not to heal or improve human functioning, but to break down personality and reconstruct it according to external demands. The medical community was particularly disturbed by the involvement of physicians and psychologists in research that violated the Hippocratic Oath and professional ethical standards. Professional organizations launched investigations into members who had participated in the experiments and established new guidelines to prevent future abuses. Neuroscientists and psychologists analyzed the techniques employed in the mind control programs and confirmed that they were capable of producing the effects described by survivors. The combination of drugs, sensory deprivation, and psychological conditioning could indeed alter memory, personality, and behavior in ways that subjects could not resist or remember clearly. The scientific analysis also revealed the sophisticated nature of the research being conducted. This was not crude experimentation by amateur researchers, but systematic investigation employing cutting-edge knowledge of neurobiology and psychology. The researchers involved were experts in their fields who had deliberately chosen to use their knowledge to harm rather than help human beings. Ethicists characterized the mind control programs as representing a fundamental corruption of science and medicine. The research had violated every established principle of ethical human subjects research, including informed consent, voluntary participation, and protection from harm. The programs represented a return to the kind of human experimentation that had been condemned at the Nuremberg trials. Block 16. The survivor's perspective. As the investigations continued and more information became public, survivors of the mind control experiments found their voices and began speaking out about their experiences in their own words. Their accounts provided a human perspective on the abstract discussions of techniques and ethics that had dominated much of the coverage. Janet Morrison, now in her 40s, described the long-term impact of her experience at Riverside. The memory gaps and personality changes she had experienced immediately after the program had evolved into complex trauma that affected every aspect of her life. She struggled with dissociative episodes, trust issues, and a persistent sense that her own mind was not entirely under her control. Michael Torres spoke about the impact on his family relationships. His wife had left him, unable to cope with his unpredictable behavior and violent episodes. His children were afraid of him during his triggered states, and he lived with the constant fear that he might harm someone he loved. The programming he had received at Riverside had turned him into a danger to those closest to him. Sarah Hamilton described the challenge of rebuilding her identity after learning that her memories and perceptions had been deliberately manipulated. She no longer trusted her own mind and lived with constant uncertainty about which of her thoughts and feelings were genuine and which had been implanted by her programmers. The psychological damage was profound and permanent. The survivors also spoke about the secondary trauma they had experienced from efforts to discredit and silence them. Many had been labeled as mentally ill, delusional, or attention-seeking when they first tried to tell their stories. They had been isolated from family and friends who couldn't understand or believe their accounts of government mind control. Despite the challenges they faced, many survivors found strength in connecting with others who had similar experiences. The formation of support networks and advocacy organizations provided validation and community for individuals who had been isolated and gaslighted. Their collective voice became increasingly powerful as more people came forward with similar stories. Block 17. Government Response and Damage Control. As the evidence of government mind control experiments became overwhelming, federal agencies launched a sophisticated damage control campaign designed to minimize accountability and prevent future revelations. The strategy involved a combination of limited admissions, scapegoating, and efforts to characterize the programs as historical aberrations that had been corrected. CIA officials acknowledged that regrettable experiments had been conducted in the past, but insisted that they had been terminated and that current operations fully complied with legal and ethical standards. They portrayed the mind control programs as the product of Cold War paranoia and emphasized that lessons had been learned from past mistakes. The government's admissions were carefully crafted to minimize legal liability while appearing to be forthcoming. Officials acknowledged general categories of experimentation, while denying specific allegations that could result in compensation claims. They admitted to conducting research with unwitting subjects while disputing the extent and impact of such activities. Scapegoating became a central element of the government's response. Lower-level researchers and administrators were blamed for exceeding their authority, while senior officials claimed they had been unaware of the specific details of the experiments. The implication was that rogue elements within the agencies had conducted unauthorized research without proper oversight. The destruction of documents was characterized as routine administrative practice, rather than deliberate evidence destruction. Government officials claimed that files had been destroyed according to standard records management procedures, and that there had been no intent to obstruct justice or hide wrongdoing. Efforts were made to shift public attention away from accountability for past actions toward reforms that would prevent future abuses. New oversight mechanisms, ethical guidelines, and legal protections were enacted, with the implication that these measures made further investigation unnecessary. Block 18. The search for other facilities. The revelations about Riverside led to investigations of other facilities that may have been involved in similar research. Patricia Chen and her network of investigators began mapping the full scope of the mind control program, identifying sites across the United States and internationally where experiments may have been conducted. Prison systems had been extensively used for mind control research, with inmates serving as unwitting subjects for experiments in behavioral modification and pharmaceutical testing. Federal prisons in Atlanta, Leavenworth, and other locations had housed research programs that subjected prisoners to extended isolation, experimental drugs, and psychological conditioning techniques. Military bases had also served as research sites, with service members being used as subjects in experiments designed to enhance combat effectiveness or resistance to interrogation. The research had often been disguised as training exercises or medical evaluations, with participants unaware that they were being subjected to experimental procedures. University campuses had been another major venue for mind control research, with professors and graduate students conducting studies funded by CIA-front organizations. Students at major universities had unknowingly participated in experiments involving LSD, sensory deprivation, and psychological manipulation techniques. Mental health facilities across the country had been involved in the program, with psychiatric patients serving as subjects for experiments in behavior modification and memory manipulation. Patients who were already vulnerable due to mental illness had been subjected to additional trauma through experimental procedures. The mapping of research sites revealed a network of facilities that spanned the entire country and involved thousands of researchers, administrators, and support staff. The scope of the program was far larger than anyone had initially suspected, involving virtually every type of institution that had access to potential subjects. Block 19. The role of academic institutions. One of the most disturbing aspects of the mind control program was the extensive involvement of prestigious academic institutions and respected researchers. Universities across the country had participated in CIA-funded research, often without the knowledge of their administrations or the informed consent of their student subjects. Harvard University had been a major center for mind control research, with psychology professor Dr. Henry Murray conducting experiments that involved subjecting students to intense psychological stress and humiliation. One of the subjects in these experiments was Theodore Kaczynski, who would later become known as the Unabomber, leading some researchers to speculate about the connection between his experience as a test subject and his later violent actions. Yale University had hosted research into hypnosis and behavioral conditioning, with experiments designed to test the limits of human suggestibility and compliance. Students were subjected to procedures that altered their consciousness and behavior without their understanding of what was being done to them. Stanford University had been involved in research into sensory deprivation and psychological manipulation, with experiments that explored techniques for breaking down personality and implanting false memories. The research had been conducted under the guise of legitimate psychological study, but the true objectives were far more sinister. The involvement of academic institutions provided legitimacy and cover for research that would have been immediately recognized as unethical if conducted in purely government facilities. The prestige of the universities and the credentials of the researchers made it easier to recruit subjects and deflect suspicions about the true nature of the experiments. Many of the academics involved in the research were never held accountable for their participation in unethical experiments. Some continued their careers as respected researchers and educators, with their involvement in mind control programs remaining hidden for decades. Others retired with honors and accolades, their contributions to human suffering never acknowledged or addressed. Block 20. International implications and reactions. The revelations about American mind control programs had significant international implications, affecting relationships with allied countries and providing propaganda opportunities for adversaries. The exposure of unethical human experimentation damaged America's moral authority and credibility as a defender of human rights. Allied countries that had participated in the research faced their own scandals and investigation. Canada launched inquiries into the experiments conducted at the Allen Memorial Institute, while Britain faced questions about research conducted at government facilities and universities. The international scope of the program revealed that democratic governments had collectively engaged in activities that violated fundamental human rights principles. Communist countries seized upon the revelations as evidence of Western hypocrisy and moral bankruptcy. Soviet and Chinese propaganda highlighted the mind control experiments as proof that capitalist democracies were no different from totalitarian regimes in their willingness to sacrifice individual rights for state purposes. The revelations undermined American credibility in international forums where human rights issues were discussed. International human rights organizations called for comprehensive investigations and accountability measures. The United Nations Human Rights Commission expressed concern about the experiments and urged the United States to provide full disclosure about the scope of the programs and compensation for victims. Other international bodies echoed these calls for transparency and justice. The revelations also affected ongoing diplomatic relationships and intelligence cooperation. Some allied countries expressed reluctance to participate in joint intelligence operations or share sensitive information, fearing that such cooperation might again be used for unethical purposes. Trust that had been built over decades of cooperation was damaged by the exposure of the mind control programs. Foreign governments began reviewing their own intelligence and research programs to ensure they were not engaging in similar activities. The international scrutiny created pressure for reforms and oversight mechanisms that went beyond what any single country might have implemented independently. The global impact of the revelations demonstrated that the mind control programs were not just domestic American scandals, but international human rights violations that affected the entire democratic world's credibility and moral standing. Block 21. Long-term consequences and ongoing effects. Years after the initial revelations about the Riverside facility and the broader MK-Ultra program, the long-term consequences continued to unfold. Survivors struggled with lifelong psychological effects, while institutions grappled with reforms designed to prevent future abuses. The impact extended far beyond the immediate victims to affect families, communities, and society's trust in government institutions. Many survivors never fully recovered from their experiences in the mind control programs. The sophisticated techniques employed at facilities like Riverside had caused fundamental alterations to personality, memory, and behavior that proved resistant to conventional therapy. Support groups and specialized treatment programs developed to address the unique needs of mind control survivors. But resources remained limited, and many victims suffered in isolation. The families of survivors also bore significant burdens. Spouses, children, and parents struggled to understand and cope with the behavioral changes and psychological symptoms exhibited by their loved ones. Many relationships were damaged or destroyed by the ongoing effects of the programming, creating secondary victims who had never directly participated in the experiments. Legal battles continued for decades as new evidence emerged, and additional survivors came forward. The government's strategy of delay and minimal disclosure meant that many victims died before receiving acknowledgement or compensation for their suffering. The legal system proved inadequate to address the scope and complexity of the violations that had occurred. Professional organizations in medicine, psychology, and research implemented new ethical guidelines and oversight mechanisms designed to prevent future abuses. Institutional review boards became mandatory for human subjects research, and informed consent procedures were strengthened. However, critics argued that these reforms were insufficient to prevent determined bad actors from conducting unethical research. The mind control revelations contributed to a broader erosion of public trust in government institutions that continued to affect American politics and society. The knowledge that government agencies had conducted secret experiments on unwitting citizens reinforced suspicions about official secrecy and fueled conspiracy theories about ongoing covert programs. Block 22. Modern implications and ongoing questions. The story of the Riverside facility and the MK-Ultra program raised questions about government accountability and human rights protections that remained relevant decades later. As new technologies emerged that offered even more sophisticated methods of monitoring and potentially controlling human behavior, the lessons of the mind control experiments became increasingly important. Advances in neuroscience, pharmacology, and digital technology created new possibilities for influencing human consciousness and behavior. Brain imaging techniques, psychoactive drugs, and electronic devices offered unprecedented capabilities for monitoring and potentially manipulating mental processes. The ethical frameworks developed in response to the MK-Ultra revelations provided crucial guidance for addressing these emerging technologies. Surveillance technologies that emerged in the digital age raised new concerns about government intrusion into private mental spaces. While these technologies did not directly control behavior in the way that MK-Ultra techniques had attempted to do, they offered unprecedented access to private thoughts, communications, and behavioral patterns that could potentially be used for manipulation or control. The global war on terrorism that began in the early 21st century brought renewed attention to interrogation techniques and psychological manipulation methods. Reports of enhanced interrogation techniques used by American forces echoed some of the methods employed in the mind control programs, raising questions about whether the lessons of MK-Ultra had been forgotten or ignored. Contemporary debates about informed consent, research ethics, and government oversight continue to reference the mind control experiments as examples of what could go wrong when safeguards failed. Bioethicists, legal scholars, and civil liberties advocates use the MK-Ultra case study to argue for stronger protections and more robust oversight mechanisms. The story also remained relevant to ongoing discussions about truth, memory, and the reliability of human testimony. The techniques developed in programs like MK-Ultra had demonstrated the malleability of human memory and perception, raising important questions about eyewitness testimony, recovered memories, and the nature of consciousness itself. Block 23. The legacy of Riverside. The Riverside Research Institute, though it operated for only a few years in the 1970s, became a symbol of the dangers posed when government power operates without adequate oversight or ethical constraints. The facility's story served as a cautionary tale about the potential for scientific knowledge to be perverted for harmful purposes, and the importance of maintaining vigilance against institutional abuse. For Patricia Chen, the investigation that began with a classified advertisement in a newspaper became a life-defining mission to expose government wrongdoing and advocate for human rights. Her work helped establish important precedents for investigative journalism and government accountability that influenced subsequent efforts to uncover official misconduct. The survivors of Riverside and similar facilities became reluctant pioneers in understanding the long-term effects of sophisticated psychological manipulation. Their courage in coming forward despite official denials and personal risk helped establish the reality of government mind control programs and paved the way for other victims to tell their stories. The network of activists, researchers, and journalists who worked to expose the mind control programs demonstrated the power of citizen investigation and advocacy in holding government accountable. Their efforts showed that even the most classified and protected government programs could be exposed when dedicated individuals worked together to uncover the truth. The legal and ethical frameworks that emerged from the MKUltra revelations, while imperfect, provided important protections for future research subjects and established principles that continued to guide discussions about human rights and government power. The reforms implemented in response to the scandals, though insufficient to prevent all future abuses, created obstacles for those who might attempt similar programs. Most importantly, the story of Riverside served as a reminder that the price of freedom includes eternal vigilance against those who would abuse power and violate human dignity. The facility may have been demolished and its records destroyed, but the lessons of what occurred there remained relevant for each new generation, facing questions about the proper limits of government authority and the protection of individual rights. The survivors, investigators, and advocates who fought to expose the truth about Riverside and MKUltra created a legacy that extended far beyond their individual efforts. They demonstrated that even the most powerful institutions could be held accountable when citizens demanded truth and justice, and that the human spirit could survive even the most sophisticated attempts to break it down and rebuild it according to external demands. The story of the Riverside Research Institute and the broader MKUltra program represents one of the darkest chapters in American government history, revealing how scientific advancement and national security concerns can be perverted to justify unconscionable violations of human rights. While the full truth may never be known due to the systematic destruction of evidence, the courage of survivors and investigators ensured that this crucial history was not entirely lost to secrecy and denial.